Folks, we're going to wrap up our section on administrative law by talking about environmental law. Environmental law is, big news today. A lot of discussion about climate change and things like that. The climate protection itself is not necessarily part of the environmental laws, but what certainly is the concerns about a wide range of pollution issues. So the laws are designed to, in a holistic fashion, to have clean air, clean water, and clean ground, basically. And there's a handful of laws. The United States started with a statement in 1969 that the policy of the United States would be to have clean air, clean water, and clean grounds. And then in 1970, we passed a very significant piece of legislation, the Environmental Protection Act, and we created the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency. As you know, it has been much discussed in the last few weeks since the election, because there's a lot of issues, and I think sometimes people conflate climate change discussions with pollution discussions, and they're really quite different animals. So in the law of the land for a long time has been pollution. Where the issue with pollution seems to be today is the issue of cost effectiveness, is whether it's really the right thing to do, and whether the cost of meeting certain standards, it merits that for our society as a whole. And a lot of this circulates, and again, was part of this year's presidential campaign, was coal. Clearly, the current administration has been anti-coal, not just neutral, not just talking about having it be a controllable situation, but really has been dramatic shutdowns in the coal industry. The reality is that coal, like any other natural resource or fossil-based resource, can be burned under the right conditions and circumstances to create energy, and there's a lot of different ways of doing that. So it'll be interesting to see what the cost benefit is, because natural gas is plentiful right now, a much cleaner and cheaper fuel to burn, so that the coal's going to have to be very cheap to make the gap up for the cost of pollution controls, which are much higher for coal than they're going to be for natural gas. Oil comes somewhere in between. Also, nuclear energy, which is generally speaking the most efficient renewable source of energy, is largely frowned upon. Nobody wants a nuclear power plant in their backyard. So I grew up with a nuclear power plant not too far away. I grew up in Norfolk. I went to high school in Norfolk, Virginia, and one of the field trips we did in high school is we went to visit the nuclear power plant. For real! And we thought it was really cool. And there's a little nuclear power plant in the southeastern Virginia, not far from where I went to high school. And it's been there for years and years and years, cranking power and providing relatively cheap electricity in the state of Virginia. So it's kind of interesting. The only nuclear
operation today?
I'm not sure, but as far as I know, it is. But what's interesting is we went about 30 years without building a new nuclear power plant. And I understand Georgia Southern, literally in southern Georgia, is building a dual reactor facility, and it's billions of dollars to build this thing, but they are building two really giant reactors. So it'll be interesting to see. And it doesn't sound like they're faced with big protests and stuff like that. So, kind of an interesting situation. So it's a little bit about it. So we're concerned about the air, the water, and the land. Air pollution, we have had dramatic changes since the Clean Air Act. We have cities like Denver, Colorado, Los Angeles, or Pittsburgh were heavily polluted. Now Pittsburgh, of course, the steel mills moved down south, so Pittsburgh had bad air because it had steel mills that burned coal to bend, create steel. And so if you stop burning the coal to do the steel, you can clean the air. So they did it the brute fashion way. They just stopped burning coal and stopped making steel. Now that steel industry initially went to Birmingham, Alabama.
So
Birmingham.
there are some negative effects to the environment by burning coal.
Oh,
versus
yeah.
other-
Oh yeah, oh yeah, there's no question
Good for
about
the
it.
EPA to enforce restriction.
Depending on how they're enforced, absolutely. Like I said, it's an economic decision as to how you require it. But remember that we're talking steel plants that were built in 1880 and burned until World War II in Pittsburgh. Then after World War II, they moved down to Birmingham. So you're dealing with different environmental periods and environmental controls. But what happened is that a lot of that activity got moved overseas. So I think Korea is the largest exporter of steel to the United States, and I know China exports steel also. One of the biggest surprises I had, some of you may be aware that they replaced one of the big elevated bridges in the San Francisco Bay Area. I think the big one from San Francisco to Oakland, the big double-decker bridge. Same one that collapsed in the earthquake during the World Series. And they, even though it's a federally funded project and all that, they brought steel in from China, which I still find pretty shocking. I know it sounds old-fashioned, but it seemed to me if you have a government project, at a minimum, you would use the steel made here in the United States. So kind of a strange deal there. But in any event, a lot of steel has gone up, and part of it is we're basically moving the pollution problem because they're moving they're not going to be using the same environmental controls that we do here, but we all share the world's atmosphere. So there's some discussion about whether that really helped the world or the United States in general. Certainly reduced the amount of employment, increased overseas spending, and some other situations. So there's a lot of issues to resolve here. It's not, it's a full equation. It's not just one number. It's an equation that involves a lot of different pieces. But the Clean Air Act has definitely had an impact. Many of you are aware of the CAFE, C-A-F-E, the fuel economy standards for American automobiles, and those are continually being cranked down. Vehicles today, it's hard to realize that the average American car in the 1950s, the giant steel behemoths, got 6 to 8 miles a gallon routinely. The Volkswagen, when it came into popularity in the late 60s, early 70s, the Volkswagen Bug the Beetle was some of them was about a 20 to 40 horsepower vehicle. First of all, a very low horsepower, 4-cylinder air-cooled rear engine, and they got about 17 miles a gallon, but compared to the 6 to 8 miles a gallon that the typical American car was getting, they were considered wonder cars because they got so dramatically, in other words, more than double the average American car. And so that led to a true revolution. And of course today, I think people can buy a non-hybrid Honda Civic and get 45 miles a gallon on the highway and maybe 30, 35 around town. So obviously we've made some real strides in that area. Water pollution is very interesting to me because I grew up as a little kid in Massachusetts in a mill town. And mill towns were created because before electricity there was water. So, the big old water wheel and stuff like that. So the plants were built right on the river. They had to be built on the river because they needed flowing water to move the wheel. And so after World War II, the mills in Massachusetts closed and moved down to North Carolina, down the road in Bangladesh and Vietnam, places like that. And the first step was they moved from Massachusetts into much larger, more efficient plants that were non-union in the Great South, especially North Carolina and that area. So what happened is as kids we would go, and none of this was fenced off, by the way. We didn't break into anything. But after school, and we're like little kids, like 6 and 8 years old, we would walk into the old mill that was right down the street from our school and wander around. And apparently it closed very suddenly because we'd go upstairs to where the accounting was done, and the rubber stamps were still sitting there, and the carbon set order forms and stuff like that were just sitting on the tables, like people that left one day expecting to come back and were told, don't come back. So I don't know exactly what happened because I was too little, but we were going to wander around, and one of the more interesting things that we discovered is we went into a room on the first floor near the warehouse part of the facility, these giant buildings, seemed giant to us as little kids. And there was a board about the size of this table. So what is this, about 5 feet long and about 30 inches wide. And there were 3 holes in the board. And around each of the 3 holes was a toilet seat nailed to the hole. First of all, just think about this in terms of personal privacy. Yeah, it's like, ew, gross. So in any event, when you look through the hole, went straight into the river. So the old story, you don't want to be downstream. Boy, you didn't want to be downstream from this plant because you know, the pollution and all that. Well, sadly, of course, during the American development period, we used our waterways as open sewers, and by the 1970s, we had done a pretty good job of killing things off. And one of my other favorite stories, other than the toilet seat adventure, was the right here in Houston at Buffalo Bayou. So I used to work downtown, or I worked at a company that had a fitness center. So at lunchtime, we'd all go in and suit up and run out Allen Parkway and come back more or vice versa. And Buffalo Bayou begins in there with a little trickle, little stream. In 1982, there was no wildlife in that stream. There were no frogs, no turtles, no catfish, things that we see in almost every body of water. By late 1987, when I stopped running downtown, moved out to Memorial Park, there were all of those. We saw catfish and all that. The only thing we didn't see is alligators by the time we left. And there's plenty of those over at the over at Point Bolivar in that area. But the point is, though, is that by focusing on having clean water, we've made dramatic strides in a reasonable period of time, roughly over a 40-year period of time. We've had a positive impact on the air and the water. Now, land is more complicated because of the nature of land use. And we don't have time to show this tonight, but I do recommend to you, if you have an opportunity, is to look at a YouTube video. It's about 11 minutes long. It's a special report that I think CBS produced, and it talks about Love Canal. Love Canal became one of the most talked about environmental problems in American history, and it's a long-running soap opera. The video that's available online was produced, I think, in 2011, and I think it was called Love Canal 30 Years After. So the short version is that there was a chemical company called Hooker Chemical Company that in the 1950s and 1960s was located up against an abandoned canal. And the canal itself is an interesting story. It's up near Niagara Falls, and it was designed to connect 2 bodies of water up in the Great Lakes, Niagara Falls area. And it was started and stopped twice, and it was never completed, but it was just so it turned out to be the world's biggest swimming pool. Well, since Hooker Chemical backed up to it, when they would make product that was off-spec, they put it in a 55-gallon drum and dump it in the canal. They did this for almost 20 years, as I understand the story. Well, what happened is Hooker went out of business, life went on. There's a Houston connection because Coastal Corporation, based here in Houston, Oscar Wyatt, had something to do. I think Hooker or some of its assets was eventually acquired and became a soap opera that even impacted Houston for some time. But in any event, what happened is people up there have basements. Anybody who lived up north? I did. We had basements. They started having seepage in their basements of bad stuff. So people become concerned about their own health, especially, again, the health of their children. When we talk about lead in children, yeah, chemicals in children, same concerns. So in any event, the big controversy ensues, a lot of yelling and hollering, and eventually they take the first 2 rows of houses along Love Canal and they buy them out. The state, federal government buys them out, put a fence up. Well, then the people who are now in the front row, because the other 2 rows are inside the fence, said, well, why are we stuck? Nobody wants to buy our houses. You know, we're all going to die, or our kids are all going to die, it's going to be horrible. So they continued a massive campaign, And that's what one of the things that's featured in the video I mentioned. And so they went ahead and eventually bought out everybody. Now, the story goes from dumb to dumber because some years ago, I don't know, 2008, 2009, they decided they've done such a wonderful job of remediating Love Canal that people can move back into some of the houses. Now, folks, we all know that it was certainly an issue campaign that the Rust Belt, this area is certainly part of Rust Belt, they don't have any jobs. There's no manufacturing up there. So I didn't know that there was a whole bunch of people standing in line they're so desperate for housing, they had to stand in line to go get houses that had been closed due to the Love Canal pollution. So, pretty strange story in large part. So in any event, what happens is that those people are now complaining that what they were sold is not as safe as they thought it was. Well, because they made them cheap and people eventually bought them is the story. But I mean, I'm like, as a taxpayer and as an individual, I'm just saying, why? There could not have been enough pressure on the housing market that people had to go out and do this. It's just crazy. But in any event, there's some continuing controversy about that. Now, what they did with Love Canal, it is such a massive area of pollution that they decided that they couldn't dig it up and move it someplace else. It was literally too large. So they encapsulated it, and supposedly it's been sealed off. And I don't know what the half-life of all those chemicals are, but I think they've said that there's like 80 different chemicals, and about 17 of the chemicals that have been identified have been considered carcinogenic. So that's, part of the concern. But in any event, it's just a big old covered swimming pool, a giant area that is that. But as a result of the concerns about Love Canal, we passed something called CERCLA, which most of us know by its nickname, Superfund. The concept behind Superfund is that we will remediate, the federal government will come in and use Superfund and remediate a solid waste site. And there's about 400 remediated or Superfund sites in the United States. And then they will go looking for the company or companies, prior owners, that polluted the site. So that the idea is it's a self-funding cycle, is they go out after the people that did it and say, let's take this back. Let's have this. And from that point, then they can have the money to do further remediation. Now, the sites that are determined to have had ground pollution are called brownfields. That's actually the proper name. And for some reason, I was receiving brownfield reports for about 18 months. I don't know how I got on the list, don't know why it stopped, but in any event, about 18 months I've got brownfield reports. And what these are sites that have already been identified. And if you're an entrepreneur or real estate developer, you can go in and buy the site with the government's help. So if the site might be worth $10 million, but it needs a $5 million remediation, you can go in and maybe buy it for $1 million or $2 million and get the government to be your partner and come in and remediate the site for you. So it presents actually an entrepreneurial opportunity if you need to build a plant somewhere and if you determine that it's an area that has some problem, you may be able to partner with the government and get a good deal and also get the site remediated at the same time for that community or that neighborhood. So it's kind of an interesting development. Let's take a quick look at the slides here. I think I've covered a lot of it. So the National Environmental Policy Act is 69. We talked about EPA 1970. I did want to mention that we do regulate nuclear materials differently. The NRC, Nuclear Regulatory Commission, is the agency responsible for just about everything that has to do with nuclear because of obviously the significant safety concerns, and that includes disposing of spent fuel rods from the active nuclear power plants and other applications using nuclear materials. So pretty interesting situation. We talked about air pollution, that's the Clean Air Act. and there's significant fines. One of the things I find interesting related again to our Greater Houston area is I came out of the oil patch when I came out of law school. I worked for 3 different major oil companies, and one of the things I was always used to, you went in a refinery, there would be a flare run, and a big refinery might have 2 or 3 flares running. I worked a lot at Shell Norco, which is Shell Oil's massive manufacturing plant. Most of you have seen it if you've ever flown into New Orleans, because when you fly into New Orleans, if you see a big refinery right underneath the flight path, that is Shell Norco, and it's you won't miss it because it's a pretty big piece of land, about 3,000 employees last I heard. But in any event, I worked strike duty during the winter one year, and we would be out there wandering around the refinery at night, and the flare would actually, which was many stories up, I think 6 or 7 stories up, was so powerful it would warm the ground underneath it. I mean, even though heat rises, it's enough heat that it would heat a big circle around the base of the flare. But what's interesting to me is this was a 24/7 thing. There were always flares burning. In the modern era, because of the Clean Air Act, if you are driving, say you're driving to Galveston, if you look to your left, you see the refineries in Texas City. If you drive out 225 to Pasadena, you look to your left again to the north, you see some more refineries like Shell's Deer Park plants over on that side. But what happens is today, if you now see a flare burning, it means there's an upset in the plant. It doesn't, they don't burn the flares. And in fact, what happens is for every minute a flare burns today, that refinery has to account for how much product was burned and how much it contributed to air pollution in the area. So it's a very different scenario than it was 40 years ago when I first was working out in the oil patch. So pretty interesting change in how we approach things. Now, some people might say, well, gosh, isn't it awfully wasteful to burn product? Well, it is. It's just that here's the following scenario. Refineries operate under extremely high pressures. So if a stop happens, a unit fails, some mechanical problem happens, and they cannot take the product for it to be processed, a cat cracker or a hydrocracker or whatever it is, in order on an emergency basis, they run that to the flare, because the alternative would be literally a massive bomb type situation where the power is going in. Again, we're talking 5,000 PSI and stuff like that. It's better to run it up the flare and burn it than it is to run the risk of a serious explosion. That's why these flares are so important as a facility. Obviously, the next thing you do is you go in and try and cut your feedstocks so that you're not wasting all of this product. But the first thing you've got to do is make sure you don't blow things up. So that's why flares have to operate in that type of environment. So, anyway, interesting situation, but that's the impact of the Clean Air Act over the last 40 years. We talk about climate change, but we can actually focus on more specific things. Before we had big discussions about climate change, we actually had a lot of discussions on something called greenhouse gases. So the discussion of greenhouse gases really is the discussion of climate change today. It's changed the terminology. But this is basically that a lot of different gases are produced. One of my favorites is cow flatulence is apparently considered an element here. And I'm not sure what we can do about that unless we put a little Ziploc bag glued to the cow's bottom or whatever. I'm not quite sure how we're going to control cow flatulence, but it's, believe it or not, an element of greenhouse gas. Acid rain, a little bit more disconcerting. We talked a lot about coal so far, and a lot of old power plants in the Northeast continue to burn coal. Coal mixed with rain, there's a pollutant in coal, sulfur, and it creates sulfur dioxide. And in fact, it is a serious enough problem that if you check your car warranty, it says if you live in certain states and you have spots on your new car finish, ain't their problem. Won't be covered by the warranty, because acid rain is considered an exclusion to spotting on your car's paint job. So we don't get that down in the south here because we're not burning a lot of coal in our plants, but it's interesting to see it. So anyway, a little bit about that. Water pollution, our main focus here is on navigable waterways, and we get into a debate sometimes about whether a waterway that's impacted has to be recorded if it's navigable or not. Obviously, many people here in Texas that have small farmettes usually have like a little pond on it and stuff like that. Those would not be subject to the Clean Water Act because they're not part of the navigable system. But we also get into wetlands, and wetlands have their own system of protection. So there's disputes about what's a wetland and what isn't, and what's a navigable waterway and what isn't in terms of types of protection. So these are some of the debates that you can anticipate moving forward as business executives. So, you have to learn each situation. One of the more interesting things in terms of water pollution was on television, I think less than a year ago. They had an old mine, I guess in Colorado or someplace like that, and they did something, government did something, not private people, but it was an abandoned mine, and they somehow triggered a water wash that went through the mine that had been abandoned and brought out a bunch of pollutant into the flowing water. So it was bright, I remember seeing on television, on the news, bright orange. So it looked pretty scary to me. I wouldn't want to be drinking out of that river or eating any fish caught in that river for some period of time. That's all I can say. But certainly a significant concern is that type of latent water pollution. But they were like saying, the government did this when they were doing something and they created a different type of problem. But certainly something that we are focused on today, hopefully is going to get things a little better there. We talked about solid waste. The initial laws, the Disposal Act goes all the way back to 1965, and then of course as part of the environmental laws, the research. Yes, sir.
Sorry, this goes back to your water slide.
Yes, sir.
If you own land and you're drilling and you find a watering hole or a watering well, do you have exclusive rights to distribute the water?
Oh, that's a really good question. Okay, so the question is if you own land and you drill for water, what are the rights to the water? I can't give you a comprehensive answer because it is such a complex answer, but let me answer it this way. First of all, in this class we're focused on national laws. So the short answer is it varies extremely from state to state. Here in Texas, generally speaking, you have the right to any water on your property. That's the general law in Texas. And Texas has got a whole body of law on water. So if somebody called me and asked me that question, I'd find an attorney who specializes in Texas real estate law because it's that specific. But generally speaking, I think you get to keep the well and the water. What you have to be careful about is it varies dramatically from community to community. For instance, my understanding in the greater Houston area, I'm assuming you're talking someplace rural, in the greater Houston area, artesian wells, which we call a ground well, have generally been banned because of subsidence. And basically what happened is we've got a big population in a small area. We've concreted just about everything we can think of. And it creates two things. It creates flooding and it creates subsidence, which increases, exacerbates the subsidence because you're putting pressure on it, you're pumping the water out and all that. But that's why we're actually lower today than we were in the past. So I don't think you can do artesian wells in the greater urban area, probably Harris County, maybe, I'm not sure about adjacent counties. I think Harris County, most of Harris County, I bet you cannot drill an artesian well to that because of subsidence and other local rules. Mostly state regulation for water, but there's all sorts of things. If you have a river that runs through your property, it's what are the rights of people downstream? Can you dam the river in your property? And there's some very complex rules on that. Also in terms of the, I'm drawing a blank on the technical word, but the accretion in the water, like most of us know, the Rio Grande River has actually changed direction, and not direction, but its channel has changed, and it's moved border lines that were based on the Rio Grande River. So you can gain land if the river subsides and you back up to a piece of water. So there's a lot of different rules rules in that area. Now, again, it varies from state to state. I would say, I'm guessing, without knowing, that California probably has very extensive laws against a state that is desperate for water, but I suspect that they don't have much artesian well water there. So the big issue there is they're bringing water from Northern California into the heavy populated Southern California, Los Angeles and San Diego. Where I think they're going to have to go next is probably extensive desalination, but my understanding of desalination is that it is extremely energy intensive, is what I understand, and that's the reason it's not being done on the big areas. It's expensive because it's so energy intensive, so you run into pollution issues in terms of using more energy, and also the expense of using that energy to generate fresh water. But I follow certain real estate things pretty closely. A lot of different parties are saying that water is going to be the single most important resource in the entire world, not just a U.S. problem, but we're going to have issues around the world. And obviously, third world countries are where we were with the open sewer and stuff like that, and hopefully we can keep some of those countries from going as far down as we did. But fresh water, I have a friend who, his charity, the charity he supports, is they go and drill artesian wells in tribal neighborhoods in Africa because the people are so desperate for fresh water, and the only real safe water is to bring it up from the ground. So it's kind of interesting. But,
yeah, and the instance I'm talking about is near College Station. Chuck Norris found a water well on his property and started bottling it. It's now called G-Force water.
Oh, my.
So a lot of people are wondering, what are the laws? Like, if it's under my property, do I get some of that cut as well, or like how is the money distributed once it's bottled?
I want to segregate the discussion because you raised two issues parallel to each other. I think with regard to water, he can pump all the water he wants unless there is a local restriction, and it's his water. However, if it was an oil well, entirely different rules apply, and the whole oil business, again, subsurface material, is a lot of times it's a pool, and you get into whether you do slant drilling and all that stuff. So the rules here in Texas for oil are quite different than the rules for water. So don't assume because he can bottle and sell the water that if he found oil, he can keep all the oil. They would have to do a study on the reservoir and determine how many properties share the reservoir. So keep that in mind. But yeah, with regard to the water, I'm not aware. I also know I've met Chuck Norris a couple of times. He used to be active with the Heights Chamber. I've belonged to the Heights Chamber of Commerce. And one of the heavyweights who founded the chamber was on a personal basis with Chuck Norris. So they have these big chamber luncheons, and Chuck Norris and I would sit at adjacent table. And my only remark on Chuck Norris is, first of all, he has really red hair. I don't know if it's naturally red, but he has really red hair, and he was an amazingly small guy. I mean, because I don't know how they do it on TV, but I mean, when I met him in person, it's like, whoa, no wonder you're doing all that fancy stuff there. Yeah, all that. But he seems like a very sharp guy, so I presume he has good counsel in that they determined that he had the right to sell it. Of course, most of the time when water is brought up like that, spring water, it has to be purified. Just because it comes up from a natural spring, they're still treated to make sure there's no contamination. So it's a sad commentary, but yeah, you can't just pull it up out of the water and drink it. But it's a lot closer to fresh than if you are using purified water on it. And we got two bottles I can see on my left eye here. This is actually a spring water product, and this Ozarka, and it's a spring water. We're not doing commercial. It's just this is a spring water process, but this still has to be purified to a certain extent. It has to be certified that there's no nematodes or other bad stuff. Now over here we have an Aquafina bottle. Aquafina is sewer water. It's I'm making you. Look at that face. Okay. Yeah. It's not unsafe, but what it is actually it's municipal water, that's just brought up, and they just put extra filters on it. The difference between Aquafina, you have a purified water over here, we have plain generic purified water here. The difference between these two products, the generic brand and the Aquafina, is that this is pure purified water, where they just take it out, they heat it, run it through a series of treatments and filters, and throw it in a bottle. Very little difference between that and regular tap water, drinking water. Now, Aquafina, on the other hand, is going to taste different, but it's the same product. The difference is Aquafina, a number of these well-promoted brands, especially Dasani, they add chemicals, they add elements to their sewer water to fool your taste buds so that it tastes more like spring water. So it's actually a treated product. It's not soda because there's no sugar or flavoring added, but they actually add elements to make it to soften the water, just as if you were using a water softener in your house.
I cannot stand design water. I can't.
The purified water?
Yeah.
Yeah, you're drinking Ozark also. And yeah, for my own house, I only buy water that says spring water. Figuring it's at least it's a little closer to the real
Better off
thing.
than the Houston tap water.
Yeah, well, I tell you, my house in the Heights, we never use the water out of the tap in the Heights because the pipes are so old there that if you pour a glass of water and let it sit, a lot of particulate and stuff like that. Now, they've gone in and changed out some of the pipes, but where we are, especially in the old houses, I have to deal with the pipes in my house over the many years of carrying polluted water through the house. Not bad, technically bad, but in terms of contaminants that we might not want in the water today, but that have been brought in there over time. Of course, the other issue I also be concerned about is lead seals in the pipes. Most of the pipes are not lead, but sometimes they use lead seals because it's more malleable metal, so introduces some health issues there.
So is that what they found in the Houston water this past week, or?
I didn't hear that story. I don't know. We got a news story on the water.
Like I guess a lot of the Houston tap water that was coming out, they had a lot of the cancer chemicals within it, and they were trying to investigate where it's coming from, since the water is being, going through the whole process that you mentioned. But it was like a big thing. It was all over the news.
Oh, I missed that one. I missed one out there. But it is a real concern, and of course, many of you are aware of the fact that Detroit, Michigan, Flint, Michigan, rather, near Detroit, had really unsafe drinking water. They had big trucks in and stuff like that. And then we also have had issues in other cities with unsafe municipal water. And it's really a big deal when that happens. We had an issue in West Virginia over the last year where it had something to do with flooding in mines and some other bad things happened. So we had some unsafe water out from West Virginia. So certainly we are doing a better job today. And I think at least the fact somebody figured it out and said, hey, this stuff's not safe. Folks,